You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture with Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb and Dr. Fredrick J. Long. Welcome and enjoy.
I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're just going to pick up Romans 7. We use a Koine era pronunciation. So the textbook that we use here at Asbury is my Koine Greek grammar. But so you might hear us pronouncing it not Erasmian. It's if you go to scholarly presentations, SBLs, you'll hear more and more all the presenters in a session using this kind of pronunciation system. So Michael Halcomb teaches conversational Koine. Randall Booth has courses immersive. Steve Runge, others. Christopher Fresh. So they'll use this pronunciation system. Michael calls it Koine era pronunciation, KEP, and I think that's a good understanding of it. But there's actual text critical evidence for it. I found a wax tablet where a teacher was dated to around 120, where a teacher was writing out a piece of Menander, and then the student was copying it, and it actually had a mistake that they both made with the verb pistevo or pistuo, actually the verb that we know really well, right, I believe. And they spelled it pistevete, but in the original it was pistevete. Well, it sounds the same. They wrote out, ungrammatically, they wrote out the last as an alpha iota, making the ending etai, which would be third middle passive, third singular, etai, Erasmian pronunciation. Kep is ete, which is the same as second person plural, ete. So the teacher got it wrong, the student got it wrong, it was ungrammatical Menander. So here's an example, and I was just simply trying to fill the space of my textbook. I had a half a page empty, and I'm like, I want to find an artifact. And I found this wax tablet, and I started researching. I'm like, holy cow, this supports KEP, the KEP pronunciation. So yeah, really interesting. So anyway, you'll hear us kind of read in a way that might sound a little different. I'm not sure what you're familiar with, Rachel. But so we're going to pick up at 7:21. So Evrisko ara ton nomon to thelonti imi piin to kalon oti imi to kakon parakita. So ara is a conjunction, post positive. It's in linguistic studies now we're Stephen Runge and Steve Levinson, and others, they're helping us recognize that these conjunctions don't mean about 10 different things or 8 or whatever, but they have a basic processing constraint. And ara is one that is marking a consequence, and it does not mark new development. Un would mark new development. The conjunction un is kind of like advancing, taking it a next step. Ara isn't doing it, but it's drawing some kind of consequence. So it's interesting to study this. Stephen Levinson, he's the Summer Institute of Linguistics international consultant, language translation consultant. So he's got a article, an essay in a collection of essays where he looks at inferential conjunctions in Paul, and he tries to figure this all out and does. And I have that chart and that research summarized in my my exegetical manual, In Step with God's Word, and I think I can pretty quickly show you where that is at. But it's really fascinating research to do. More work needs to be done. It's like on page 132, I think. No, just a little bit earlier, where a new way of looking at these connectors, these conjunctions, is as connectors with a limited processing constraint. So here's my discussion of that. So instead of a semantic approach where, if you look up un, oftentimes it's 8 or 10 different meanings, and they're alternative meanings in English. It's contrast, sometimes additive, sometimes causation. It's just really confusing. And then that's not actually how languages work. So languages have these particles called connectors that have a more limited set of constraint that it puts on the meaning of the discourse. And so here I have a chart where I summarize the work of Levinson and Runge and Fresh. So Un is marking inference and consequence, whereas Ara is marking that. Un has a distinctive development aspect to it. It's advancing the argument. And then I have a little discussion here. This is from Levinson, that essay. He says, Ara constrains what follows to be interpreted as a consequence of what has already been stated in the context. It typically introduces a direct logical consequence of usually a single proposition. So as we look at Ara, it's drawing a consequence. And if we were to go back and look at these earlier verses, this is what he's been talking about, is the struggle that I have, the good I want to do, I can't do. And this is the consequence that he's drawing. He says, I find that then the law.
So how would you differentiate in translation between like Un and Ara? Or are they translated the same, but there's just a deeper understanding in exegetical work that you can bring?
They're often translated overlappingly, but Un is somehow marking a next step. There's some new information being added as a consequence.
Okay. And then Ara is sort of
Ara is not.
This is just a consequence.
It's just a consequence. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So teasing that out exegetically is what needs to be done next. So I'd recommend reading Levinson's article and really trying to get your mind around what he's doing. But it's a new way of thinking about these connectors. Wherefore and therefore.
Very catchy.
Yeah, very catchy. Let me see. It's called Therefore, Wherefore. What's the difference? And if you email me, I'll send you it. I actually have it. It's kind of, it's like in an essay. It's hard to get a hold of, so I can send it to you.
Okay, I'll do that.
I have it right here. It was actually a presentation, and then eventually it was published as an article. Yeah, so I actually have it right here on my Zotero. Yeah. Okay. We usually don't go this detailed. Sorry. We usually jump right into it. Okay. So I find the law, and then you have this dative, to thelon imi. I think this is a dative of respect. It's kind of like a suspended dative clause, but it's a nominal clause in that it's referring to me wanting to do the good. Literally, to me wanting to do the good. That is, with reference to me wanting to do the good. So I think this is would be called a dative of reference or respect. And this is kind of odd as well. So evrisko ton nomon, I find the law. Now that may be an accusative of respect. I find with respect to the law. With respect to me wanting to do the good. So there's almost like two layers of qualification, because this is what I'm finding. I think that's the best way to take it. And then you have the OT. See that OT? That's the content of what he's found about the law. I find that. This is what I'm finding. So this again is a consequence of his previous argument where he's been just like going back and forth. I'm having a struggle in my flesh and it sucks, and I want to do good, but I do bad. And so here he's kind of like, this is what I conclude. This is what I find. I'm finding this. That, to me, in me, the evil lies at hand. So this verse then is about Paul drawing a consequence. I'm finding that with regard to me, that the good lies right at hand. And this verb para kime is it the key part of it means to be near, and then the para is like beside, or no, the key part is like to lie or lay. And then the para is the preposition added to it, and profiles nearness. So it's a little bit of an unusual verb, and it's interesting. So he's saying that even though I want to do the good, with respect to me, evil is right there. It's right there. This is lying right beside me, laying right beside me. It's at hand. It's ready. These are some different definitions that it has. Parakime. A lot of times I like to look at classical uses. I think there can be a sense that this is it could be like a military word. And the reason I would even begin to consider that is because the next verse, he deploys military imagery. He's talking about warring against the law. And he's talking about taking me captive. So it's almost like laying at hand, ready to ambush. That might be the sense of it. So not just near, but like in an ambush kind of way. It's like right there.
Like crouched or something.
Yeah, crouched and ready. And so this has to do with just kind of being aware that as we communicate, we're often working with metaphors, and that once we're kind of in a way of thinking, we attract and recruit other words into that frame of reference. And so we'll see in the next verse, it's like military, like this is a battle. This is a very bad battle. And here is the evil right there.
How would you describe that as like a semantic domain in which a passage is working? Or I'm not sure what language would describe that best.
Yeah.
Semantic field or something?
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is it's like a metaphor field, like it's a discourse field of some type. I don't know the right language to use. I just know that language works this way, that it attracts. I mean, this is why we know what words mean in context, because we understand the domain that it's in. When we're working with Greek, we don't, we just get these wooden translations, and we don't think, we don't get to see the Greek word. That's why we learn Greek, is so that we can recognize this. Plus, I have a classics degree where I was translating Thucydides, and I think I remember seeing this word. So the more that you kind of know the classical world, the more that you can recognize, well, this doesn't just mean to be beside. It actually means to like lie in wait, and can be used in ambush context. And this is probably precisely his point, as he's going to be talking about, because he may be actually. I think he's then showing a progression. In other words, lies at wait, wars against me, takes me captive. So now I look at the sequence of these, it actually is like a step-by-step of how it occurs. So I don't know if scholars have seen this kind of thing, but this is how I think about the text. I think this is how language works. Okay, so now...
It sounds like Cain.
Pardon me?
It sounds like Cain.
Good, yeah.
Sin is crouching.
I was about to say that. Yeah, sin is crouching, ready to take you down. Yeah, I was thinking of that. I was going to say that. That's right. So I think this is evocative of that. And I love the fact that the Lord like warns him ahead of time. He's very compassionate, He's like warning him, and Cain's like ignoring God. I mean, that's kind of what we do. He warns us. Okay, so verse 22 then. Someone want to read that out loud?
I don't know Kep yet, so I won't be able to do that.
I'll give it a shot.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Sunidome gar to nomo tu theo kataton exo anthropon.
Good. Yeah, very good. Nicely read. So gar is the postpositive conjunction that's marking strengthening or support. So gar, that's what its processing constraint is, strengthening. And you can strengthen in different ways. You can strengthen by logical support. You can strengthen by elaboration or explanation. But basically, gar strengthens the previous statement. And so how is it strengthening it? He's going to say this, I delight Sun edome, I delight in, and I think this verb takes the dative as its direct object. Yeah, I'm guessing. Well, soon is going to take the dative. Yeah, when soon is a prepositional affix to a verb, it takes direct objects in the dative. Yeah. So I delight in the law of God. Kata ton iso eso anthropon, according to the inner person, the inner self. And kata is kind of a weird preposition to use here. It's like a standard, indicating some kind of standard. So I don't know if it's almost like in principle in the inner, if it's stating some kind of principle, which kind of makes sense. Like, I delight in the law of the Lord in my inner person. In my inner person makes sense. In fact, that's how the NASB translates it, in my inner person. But kata, we don't normally think of kata as in. So kata is profiling a different kind of meaning and like a place of reference according to. Yeah, I'd like to study that a little bit more. It's not simply just in as a spatial sense. It's something else, as like a standard, or something. When I think of kata, I think of it as a standard, mainly. But I see, so here Paul is in an observational mode. I see another law. So this is verse 23. Now the de is a postpositive marker, and that constrains the discourse as a new or distinctive development. So de marks new development. And now he's starting to advance, making new points. He's not just drawing consequences, he's advancing to a new point. He says, I see another law. I see another law in my members. And this word members, it can refer to body part, as a member of a whole, like Christian community. So this could be used as like a member of a community. Here it seems to be, it's almost like he's recognizing that somehow in his bodily members, fleshly members, he sees another law. And this other law, this eteron nomon, and I think eteron is interesting because he could have used allos. And there used to be a distinction made classically, but now New Testament scholars, they don't tend to see it. Hi, welcome. As legitimate. That allos indicates another of a similar kind, whereas heteros indicates another of a different kind. But some people then thought, well, New Testament authors aren't speaking so precisely. But I don't know. I always, if this is how it's used classically, and this distinction can often be found, I'm thinking, why not allow the New Testament authors that possibility? And here, it may be that Paul is saying that there's a different kind of law going on here. And it makes sense. You're right, you get the law of God, which inside of me, a certain part of me really delights in. I delight in this other law. But I see now another law. So this other law of a different kind is in my members. And then we get a further description of that other law. Anti-stratev omenon. And that's quite a mouthful. The anti means against. That's a preposition, anti. And then you have the stratev ome. So this is the verb stratev ome, which means to war, be at war with. And the anti just stresses against. I'm not sure that anti is necessary. Like, I think the verb stratev o or stratevome may be its own verb. I'm gonna search for that. And this is where my interest in the Greek language is, like, noting these places of extra stress. And so I think there's another verb that could have been used, and it would have been the verb straktevo. Straktevo could have been used, but when you add that anti, you're upping the oppositional nature of it. So straktevo means to advance with an army or fleet, to wage war, and it could have been put in the middle voice as well, middle, to serve in the army. So I guess that wouldn't have worked because it's not serving in the army. So there is maybe a slightly different sense, and so maybe the anti is necessary, but it's certainly adding this oppositional nature to what this other law is doing. And then it takes the dative case. So this would be an example of a attributive participle, an adjectival participle that's functioning attributively, and is basically telling us more information about what this other law is doing. It's waging war against the law of my mind. And so to nomo, against the law to nous mu, the law of my mind. So we're in verse 23. Stephanie, sorry. Ke ak malo tids onta me. And then this is also accusative. So the onta is a participle ending that's accusative, masculine, singular. So the omenon is accusative, masculine, singular. Omenon is a middle passive participle ending. Onta is an active participle ending. That's kind of where they look different. But the omenon, the on, should be recognizable as like a masculine accusative singular, that on ending. You've seen that a lot. That's a second declension, masculine accusative singular ending. But the middle passive participle, as you'll learn next week, has omen. That's the coupling syllable after the verb stem. You get omen, and then you have first or second declension endings on it. So yeah.
What's noos?
Noos, nous is mind. Yeah, and that's a third declension noun that has the os is the third declension ending. Os.
Double omicron make a oo sound?
Yeah, so what's happening is that the omicron, somehow it's I'd have to go back and look at the stem, but the genitive os is winning out so that it's differentiated. I think it's trying to be differentiated from the nominative form. Otherwise, it would look the same. Because nous is omicron upsilon, and then when you add the os ending of the genitive, it should technically look the same, nous again, but then you don't have a differentiation between the nominative and the genitive form. Because when you have an omicron upsilon and then an omicron added to it, it's going to look like us again. So in writing out and pronunciation, they made that distinction. They just let the regular third declension os ending, the os, win out to be more evident. Yeah. So here we're seeing a double two-stage what he's seeing in the law. He's seeing this other law goes to battle against and then take me captive. That's not a good thing. So this verb ak malo tidzonta, that means you've been defeated and now taken as a captive. So it's not just warring against, but actually defeating me. And that's not a good thing. So this is the end of the progression. So Stephanie, in verse 21, the last word in verse 21 means to parakita. That verb parakita means to like be present with, but it's often in the sense of like laying an ambush, like ready to take me on. So I think there's a metaphor that Paul is using, and he's actually describing a progression, like lays at wait, fights against me, and takes me captive. So I think we're seeing the ending of this metaphor, and the metaphor would be something like our struggle with sin is like a battle. That's a metaphor. Life is a battle. My struggle with sin is a battle. And there's different principles at work in this. And Paul is using these verbs of, verse 21 begins with evrisko, I'm finding. Then verse 23, I'm seeing, or bliko, I'm seeing. So it's almost like he's an observer, like an investigator observer is like, dang, this really sucks. This is what's going on in my life. I'm seeing this going on. In my inner person, I love God. I love God's law. But then there's this other thing, and it comes against me. And next thing I know, I'm taken captive. It's not a good state to be in. So taking me captive by the law of sin. Hi. Hey. This is Chow Chow or Lifney. Rachel's watching from Oregon. She's a prospective doctoral student.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
Thank you, sir.
there's Rachel. Yeah. So I'm introducing her to people as they join.
Okay.
So Chow Chow is a
Hello.
first year New Testament PhD student.
Hello, Rachel.
Yeah. So all right. So now we're getting further description of being taken captive. So it's taking me captive in the law of sin. I think everyone can follow that, right? The vocabulary, en to nomo tes amartias. And then you have, we were talking about this yesterday in class, or 2 days ago. There's the to onti. The to onti is the participle form of imi. And I said oftentimes it doesn't seem to be necessary. Here I think it may be. Being, it means being. So what is it modifying? It is helping to specify something. Like if we removed it in our translation, it probably wouldn't make a difference, right? Because I could say it takes me captive in the law of sin in my members. But technically, literally, it is the law of sin that is present in my members. And that is present is grammatically marking masculine dative singular, and that tells us what it is. What is the that? That is being. What is being in my members? And in the context, we have to find out what it matches with grammatically. You got a reference to law, and you got a reference to sin.
So it's going to law.
It's going to law. So in this case, it may help to delimit, it does help to delimit what is in my members. The law is in my members. But the law characterized by sin is in my members.
Like, are there debates on the which type of genitive this is?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, what kind of genitive?
Sin
Yeah.
law or
Yeah. The law of sin, is it the sinful law? That'd be a attributive genitive. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge question. And also I think it's worth kind of teasing out, like, what is Paul really saying here? Like, is there a difference to say the law is in my members, this law which is characterized by sin? That's different than saying sin is in my members.
but within the context, because he's talking about a number of different laws.
Yeah.
Like earlier, it seems
Yeah.
like he's talking about Mosaic law, other places
Yeah.
otherwise.
Like a principle. Yeah.
Perhaps this isn't like a characteristic of law, but a different kind of law. Like, does that make sense?
Well, I think it is a different kind of law. Yeah, it's an heteronomon, another kind of law, but almost like a principle. And if you think about the nature of sin, sin is always a mockery, right? Sin is always derivative. Sin, it depends on good for its existence. Like, in fact, Augustine defines sin as like the absence of good. Like it's there. It's not really there. It's always derivative. So in a sense, to even attribute it as a law is kind of like almost granting it too much credit in a sense. But Paul is trying to describe what he's experiencing here. So there is something going on. And the other thing too that I wonder about, I don't want to get into heresy here, but a lot of times we adopt a Platonic worldview where physical stuff is bad, our bodies are bad, and our mind and our souls and spirits are good. Well, that's Platonic dualism, and that's rejected by Hebrew scriptures. I mean, and so the point I often make is that physical matter is not inherently sinful. And I know that sounds kind of weird to say, but somehow sin is passed along. But to think that sin is natural to me and being physical, that's heresy. I think that's heresy. It is not. Sin is foreign to me. We are not made to sin. We are made to be good. We are made for good. And when God made us physically, he said it's tov tov, it's very good. So I just want us to get in a different mindset. A lot of times think, I can't help myself, it's human nature. Like, no. That's not even correct. It is not human nature. Our human nature is not to sin. God made human nature good. So here he might be saying something in that regard. This law that this sin thing is going on, that's in my members. So that's different than saying sin is in my members. It's a slight difference. And I wonder if this could be teased out more theologically, or needs to be teased out more.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand, how would he define law here? Is it like something which compels obedience? Because if it's like the way I think of law is something that I can choose to obey or not, but this it seems to have some sort of compulsion or attraction to it.
Yeah, this is dominating. Yeah, this is always present, lying in wait to ambush me. It's warring against the law of my mind.
It's active. It's not just
and it's taking me captive. Yeah, so it's doing something different. I think he's struggling to describe it. Like he's really struggling. But I think there's a lot here to be teased out that the Greek text is pointing us to. So the to onti is helps us see that this law characterized by sin is in my members. This principle, I think it's like almost a principle. It's another kind of law, though. It's not the same kind as the law of God. But I love Psalm 1. Psalm 1 talks about, I delight in the law of the Lord, and on that law I meditate day and night. And that's like a turning point, right? So Psalm 1 is paradigmatic. It begins the whole Psalter and says, I don't stand in the seat of sinners. I don't walk in the way of whatever. It's like sit, stand, walk with sinners. Like, I don't do those kinds of things. Instead, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on that law he meditates day and night. And I'm just always challenged by that delighting. Like, the word delight talks about enjoyment. Like, what is it that I delight in? And so Psalm 1, and then I'm looking here, Paul is saying, in my mind, it's about the law of God. I love the law of God in my mind, in my inner person, right? Verse 22, I delight in the law of God. But somehow there's some other law going on that is in my members. This other law is in my members. This other principle. He doesn't say sin is in my members, but this law is in my members. Sin is right there, and it takes me captive. Yeah.
Do you think he may have someone in view here? Because there is this progression of movement. However, in Psalm 1, it's about the person, whereas in this, it's the sinful law working against you.
Yeah. He's personifying sin, for sure. Sin is personified, or this other law is personified. Yeah. Sin and law. And that's a big question. Who is the I here? I think at some point he does speak autobiographically, but some people argue that it's Adam. Some people say it's kind of like an ideal person, trying to live under the law, kind of like an ideal Jew. I think Paul probably experienced some of this, although other places in Paul, he talks about, I obeyed the law blamelessly. So it's like, well, how does that square? And is it possible to fully obey the law and still miss the mark? And he'd say, yeah, you could, that can still happen. You can still be law obedient in certain respects and still not fulfill the law of love. So it's a big question. Who is this I here? To me, it seems, though, that it does reflect some autobiographical observation. We're seeing, I find, I see. And then verse 24, talep poros ego anthropos. Now notice here there's no connector, right? What's that called? There's no conjunction.
No predicate.
And there's no predicate. That's right. So we're missing the connector, and there's no verb. A syndeton. Yeah. And a syndeton can indicate different kinds of relationships. So the lack of connector might indicate a break, like a new section, but that's not going on here. It may signal an evaluative statement. It may indicate a move from general to particular. And it may indicate like a rhetorical flourish, like a parallelism. I don't think that's going on here. I think it's an evaluative statement. It's really interesting. Like there's no Greek particle that means that. And so then you use a syndeton. So syndeton is used when there's no connector to specify particular to general or general to particular. So there's no connector to signal that. And so that you don't use any connector. And I think this one is an evaluative statement. And it's a bald statement. It's verbless. I, myself, miserable person, which is pretty funny. It makes sense today, right? Like we get the impact of that. No connector. Just like it's a simple verbless statement. Miserable person.
But in Greek, miserable is in the first position. Is that?
Yes.
Is that an emphatic?
Yes. Yes, it is. So the taleporos is forward, and this is also, I think, like a new idea. So it is prominent because of that. Yeah, that's what the stress is. The stress is on miserableness, I person. Miserable I person, literally. And it's not a man. And I wish our translations would have gotten way better. So I like the NASB because it's literal. It tends to be a little bit more literal, but it so consistently translates anthropos as man. It's not. It just means person. Human, yeah. Miserable. I am a miserable person. I'm a miserable human. And then another ascendaton, no connector, tisme, rusete, who me will save. Who me? Focus on the me. Me is fronted again, it's forward. And I think I see this a lot in Greek. It's I call this principle of abutment. It's kind of a fun word, abutment, when you abut two things together. In the mental conception, it means that they're held together in the mental frame. And here I think it's like agency, me needs to be acted upon by an agent. Like I'm helpless, who helped me? Like these are together. Like this, I need someone for me right away. Like this agency, who to help me? Like I think that's what's achieved by having the tisme together. Who me will save from the body of this death. From the body of this death. This body characterized by this death. And this death, I mean, it's a metaphorical way of describing it. I think this could be the next step of the progression. So you have sin crouching ready, fighting against me, winning, taking me captive, and then I'm captive, and my maybe sometime, if you're a slave, your best hope is to die. Like this could be like the last step. It certainly is the consequence of sin. Sin as a battle. Struggle with sin as a battle. That's the metaphor. And I think it goes from present and lying and waiting, fighting against me, taking me captive, and eventually I'm going to die from it. It's going to kill me. Slavery, I'm going to die. In battle, I'm going to die. Either I get killed in the battle or I'm going to become a slave and then die. So I think this is the extension of it.
to be a descriptive characterized by death.
Yeah, characterized by death. Yeah, deathly body, this body of death. Yeah. Now, he doesn't say mortal body. I think that's interesting. Like there is a word for mortal. I always think that if he uses a noun in a genitive relationship, with another noun rather than an adjective, I think to have two nouns to describe something, I think that's more concrete. Like I think there's a kind of prominence to both of them. Whereas if you use an adjective mortal, that's kind of subordinating it to the other. So I think this is the way that he's worded it here is to stress the death consequence. And that's just a subtle thing, but that's just my view of it. Is I think in the mental conception, we're forced to have two categories open, two nouns. So nouns represents categories, whereas adjectives are like attributes. Like they don't stand alone. They're like, what is it describing, right? Does that make sense? So when you have two nouns, you have to have two folders open. And he's got the body folder open, now he's got the death folder open. So I think it's a way that really stresses death as this kind of consequence. So charis de to theo. Thanks, but thanks be to God. So here we have de. So de indicates new development. So this is new, and we can see it as new. Thanks be to God.
Is that a dia in Erasmus?
The dia.
Yeah.
Oh, just de. What are you seeing?
Okay, I guess I have dia.
Oh.
Dia.
Oh, that would be dia. Yeah, that'd be dia. I'm looking at the second word. Do you have the de there?
I don't have a de.
So charis de.
Nope.
Oh, okay. Are you working with SBL GNT or what is that, Tyndale House?
I believe this is SBL, yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So the SBL doesn't have a de, apparently. So there is a textual variance going on there. Yeah.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So you have de to theo.
Yeah. Charis de theo. This is the NA28, UBS 5 would have a de there. So this is textual variation. And I'm looking at about 5 different readings here. Some have charis to theo, some have a charis to theo, some have a charis curio,
Interesting.
and then some have ev charisto to theo, I give thanks to God. So you got 5 different readings here.
Yeah.
Obviously the scribes are really working this over, like, what does Paul mean here? Let's try to clarify this for Paul. Yeah, this is what scribes did. I mean, these are all intentional changes. It's not like an accident of the ear. They're like working it over, changing it to God from the dative to the genitive, changing God to the Lord, and then changing it to a verb form.
The de seems to make more sense to me here because that would be like, but it's in contrast to all this stuff.
Yeah, it's a new development. Yeah, it's advancing to the next thing. Yeah, but thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Therefore then, ara un. So here the ara is drawing a consequence, and the un is new development and drawing a consequence. So this is like the big final conclusion and kind of bringing it to like the final point. I myself, avtos ego. This is like the most emphatic way to stress the subject, right? You don't need ego. You don't need avtos. Avtos is a way to stress the subject as well. Even though it's a third person adjective, it can be used with second or first person verbs. And here you have both it and the ego. It's hard to translate. I myself, in fact, I myself. And then you have men and da. Men and da. To men ni. Noi, I should say, noi. The men works with the da. So this is a kind of construction. You have the men da construction. On the one hand, men. On the other hand, da. This is a good classical idiom.
You're talking about the de before sarki?
Yeah, those work together. And what makes them a little bit tricky is they're both post-positive, so they're placed second. So the te de sarki, that starts the next clause. Yeah. So on the one hand, in my mind, to no e, that's the word mind again, it's a dative. Notice that the article helps you parse it, right? Thank God for the article, parsing third declension nouns. With regard to my mind, dulevo, that's the verb serve, or am enslaved to the nomu theou. So in my mind, I'm enslaved to the law of God, but in my flesh, the law of sin, the law characterized by sin.
Is Paul using the doulos word for slavery to sin earlier when he's talking about slavery to sin? Or is he using a different word?
I think he is using delevo.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he used take captive. That's a different word. That's a real technical, the ak malo tidzonta in verse 23. But earlier, yeah, he was using a delevo and that kind of thing last semester when we were reading. Right, this question came up, I think.
Is the de here function as a contrast of these two components, or is like a comparison?
De only signals new development, but in certain contexts where you have two things in contrast, it's used in contrast in a contrastive way. But de does not mean contrast; it just means new development. But the content can be contrastive.
Okay.
And yeah, Levinson makes this point really clear. And in fact, it's a pretty strong contrast where the what is contrasted is not to be seen as still like it's being replaced. It's being replaced. It's a pretty severe. Whereas with ukala, the Allah is correcting something, and the other thing is still present in some way. So it's interesting the difference between the two. That when it's used in these contrastive senses is making like a really strong statement.
Okay. So what is men here function here?
Men, Steve Runge and Levinson, they'll talk about it being anticipating. It's forward pointing.
Okay, and this is still like anticipating. I know when it's like conjunction is anticipating, but here it doesn't feel like a conjunction at all.
Yeah, well, it's working with the de. The men is working with the de, and this is just a good classical idiom. You see men de a lot. Men de. On the one hand, this. On the other hand.
Okay.
And here, there's a pretty strong contrast because you have different laws. You have mind contrasted with flesh, and you got the law of God versus the law of sin. So you do have a contrastive context. That is still making a new development. It's not marking contrast. In this context, there is contrast, but that's because of the content of the thing, not because of death.
Got it.
Yeah.
I can't remember, what's the significance of an article being separated by the noun? Like when we translate Wisdom of Solomon, they'd have like 6 words in between them. But I can't remember what the significance is. Is it stylistic variation, or is there something
Yeah,
else?
I mean, I call that a sandwich technique. I think it's a way to kind of package it in the mental conception under the get. So they had the article, then all these modifiers, then the noun. That's called the first attributive position. I think it's just a way to kind of keep that information packaged together.
Okay.
When you have article, noun, article, adjective, you're adding that extra article and you're putting that modifier in the last position. It's getting the last word. That's the last thing in the mental representation. So you get the noun and then you add this attribute that has a little bit more staying power. That's when you're stressing that attribute.
Interesting. Okay.
But when it's all sandwiched together, it's all part of the conception. It seems like when you have the adjective last, you're trying to put a little bit extra stress on that.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not lost in the big sandwich. Yeah.
Are you talking about the adjective in the second attributive position as adding more stress? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Second attributive position is stressed. Yeah. It's stressing that attribute. Even Wallace will say that, and I think Porter as well. Yep. All right. Well,
what's the significance of the fact that he used somatos in verse 24, but in 25 he used sark?
That is a great question, and probably someone's written a book on that or a dissertation. Maybe Rachel will do that. We'll see. No, she says no, she's not. So I guess it's open, Jeff. Yeah, what's the difference between somatos and sarki? To me, somati, so this is where cognitive linguistics is really helpful. So somati profiles the body as a functioning whole. Sarki profiles us as creatures who have physical needs in our existence. I think it's that physical needs and that fleshly composition, that's what's stressed with flesh, whereas soma is simply the body as a whole in terms of functioning.
Does Paul himself have the trajectory of using this too?
As what?
Like this Paul, the author, the Paul author, have the trajectory or the pattern himself to use when to use
I think so. Yeah, I think that's just a question. Like, can you tease out why he's using sarks where he does versus soma? I would think so. So in other words, in verse 24, he's looking at the body as a whole and then associating with it death, and that's just kind of tragic. But when he's talking about sarks, he's dealing with our bodies as containing passions and needs, and that goes more naturally with sin. Yeah. Because I think so when he's talking about our bodies and our members, he's going to be using soma, because soma is our bodies as comprised of parts and functioning. When he's talking about sin, I think he might more likely use sarks. But sometimes sarks is used quite innocently, like it's not inherently bad. Again, sarks is not bad. It just is our creaturely fleshliness. It just means that we are subject to passions and desires and needs, but it is a part of our existence. So Paul says in Galatians 2:20, "For in the flesh I live by faith in the Son of God." It's not bad. It's just that's my need. In fact, I think as fleshly creatures, our temptation is to live independent of God and to try to satisfy ourselves, our own needs, our food needs, this need, and to live independent of God. And that's the nature of sin and idolatry, is when we're just kind of focused there and we're kind of stiff-arming God. So for Paul to say, "In my flesh, I'm living by faith," that's a really important statement, because it means that as a fleshly person, like, we can't ever escape our flesh, that we can have a faith stance that is appropriate. So Galatians 2:20 is a really significant verse. So yeah, he uses flesh neutrally at times, positively even, or just neutrally. But here it's really associating it with sin, and body with death, and members of my body. Yeah. Like, I don't think he'll talk about members of my flesh. See what I'm saying? So that begins to start to show the difference, that body is kind of like the functional thing with body parts. But yeah, I think if you were to look through and study these words, you'd start to see these patterns. Yeah. Well, thanks for your time, and I guess we're over time, but fun to get translating together.
You're gonna continue in Romans 8, or?
Yeah. Well, we're not gonna stop the story right now, man. It's gonna get really convicting here. I mean, we're not gonna be off the hook. In fact, we're gonna see the salvation of God. Yeah, it's gonna be great. So, all right.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.